This is day 14 of our Reset Diary, and these are very important Psalms and very important days as God has us on a journey to come into a whole new place of connection with Him and also with our world around us as we learn how to operate in the world according to God's covenant. And with that covenant, as we fulfill our part of that covenant, then God releases blessing into our lives, into our efforts, into our relationships, into our generations, and into all that we do. Now, this is an important psalm. So the psalm you'll be looking at today is Psalm 86. And Psalm 86 is important, and it's a psalm that has many significant things to say to us. In fact, there are some parts of this psalm that are quite memorable, and maybe some things that are said in there that you remember reading at other times or in other parts of the Bible, or maybe even you've quoted part of this scripture and one yesterday and maybe some of the ones after it. These are very familiar things. But one of the things I want to bring to your attention as you look through Psalm 86 today is the whole idea of what God's covenant is and what that covenant connection with God is about. Because I think there's been a lot of confusion about that for many, at least there was for me. And I grew up learning about His covenant. And we've talked about it already in this particular journey. But I want to talk about it today because there's some very unique words that are used in this psalm, one in particular that's used twice in the psalm. And it's the word that is translated, oftentimes translated, loving kindness. Let's see if I can find it here as I look through it. If you look in verse 5, where it says abounding in love, and then in verse 15, where he says abounding in love again. This is a very unique word. It's been studied a lot in the Hebrew. The word in Hebrew is chesed. The hard CH sound, C-H-E-S-E-D, chesed. Chesed doesn't mean just love, because love has a range of meaning to it. And and loving kindness was just another generation's way of trying to translate this into a useful term. The word chesed has also been interpreted to mean loyal love or covenant love. Let me describe better what this idea of covenant love means, because it's a very specific kind of love that God imparts and demonstrates to those who move in covenant with Him. Now, what does it mean to move in covenant with Him? Well, we've just seen through the Passover, and we commemorated what Jesus did on the night on which He was betrayed. It says He took the cup and he said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." Okay? In saying that, He wasn't saying so much that that's all there was to it. He was saying that His blood was initiating this covenant. Now, the cup that Jesus took at the time was called the third cup of the meal. The third cup was called the cup of blessing. And so Jesus was saying that His blood was initiating or opening the way for people to enter into a blessing covenant with God. That is a covenant that when they entered into that covenant with God and fulfilled the terms of that covenant, then they could be able to experience the blessings that God said He would impart to those in covenant. Now, to understand more about covenant, you have to remember is that God's covenant with us is not like our contracts with other people. We all have been probably in situations where we've signed contracts. Most of the time we sign contracts for someone that we've agreed to do something with. and we're kind of either coming together as partners in an enterprise or an endeavor. And so we're kind of like equals, agreeing or obligating ourselves to fulfill certain things as a part of our contractual agreement. When you go to work for someone, you sign a work contract, you agree to fulfill certain parts of that work, and as a result of fulfilling that work, then the company agrees to pay you. That's how a contract works. God's contract with us is different in this way, is that God is the one who offers the contract and sets all the terms. We either receive those terms and step into it, or we don't. We don't have the opportunity, we don't have even the freedom to set the terms. The terms are set solely by God. And we either enter into the terms He offers us, or we don't. Now, the activator of that covenant was Jesus, as we see Him say when He said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." Jesus' death initiated this covenant, and it activated it so we could enter into it. This covenant had already been around for some time, but it had not been activated like Jesus activated. In fact, the covenant was offered to Israel in the Old Testament at the time of Moses. And had God invited Israel to come meet Him on the mountain. See, when they came to Sinai, they didn't know God. God introduced Himself to them, and the first thing He did was offer them, invite them to come up and meet Him face to face. Now, when God does that, when He offers you that, your choice is either to take it and enter into whatever it is that means for you, or you can stay in and not go in, and you run the risk of God being angry. That's what happened to Israel. They refused to go up the mountain. See, had they gone up the mountain, God was going to meet them face to face. So you can't have a covenant with God on your terms. These were God's terms for Israel at that time. Come to me. He invited them to come to Him, and they refused. It didn't mean that He didn't continue in a covenant connection with them, but the thing that would activate that covenant fully did not happen. Had they gone up on the mountain, God was going to do three things. First of all, He was going to forgive their sins. Okay? Secondly, He was going to meet them face to face and speak to them, and by speaking into them, He was going to speak a new heart into them. And secondly, He was going to breathe on them, because as He met them face to face and He would speak with them and would speak this new heart into them, okay, then His breath of His Spirit, His breath would come into them, and they would come alive. Okay? All of those things that Jesus said He came to do. See, Jesus came because God says, "I want you to meet me again face to face." Jesus says, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." Jesus was God's way of saying, "I've coming to meet you, but my terms are here." Jesus says he breathed the Spirit on people. He told them they could be born again, new hearts. He even forgave sins. Everything that God wanted to do on Mount Sinai, Jesus came and demonstrated it. Why? Because Jesus, like His Father, He was ready to open up this new covenant to people. The new covenant isn't just forgiveness of sin. Forgiveness of sin is what allows us to operate in this new covenant. The new covenant is a covenant of blessing. It's a covenant in which God promises that if we move with Him, that we can become fruitful and multiply and be full. That's why Jesus says, "If you remain in me and I in you, you'll bear much fruit." He says, "I've come that you might have life and have it to the full." See, Jesus didn't come just to get our sins forgiven, Our sins being forgiven, though, were an important link, like a gateway that opened the way for us to step into this relationship of blessing. That's where God was going all the time. He was taking care of the things in us that prevents us from entering this relationship. God dealt with those in the person of Jesus. And he's removed those things as an obstacle. And everything that he did in the Old Testament prepared the way for this, so that when Jesus came, this covenant would be fully open and fully active. Well, that means then that in that covenant, God sets all the terms. And we choose either to operate in those terms or we don't. And God's very clear about people who are in covenant with him. He says, here are my terms. If you listen to me, I will bless you this way, this way, this way, this way. But he says, if you resist me, if you refuse to listen to me, if you don't keep the things I say to you, then here are the things that will happen. Those things are called curses. There's blessings and there's curses. These are the indicators of whether a person or a people is operating in covenant with God on God's terms or on their own terms. The book of Judges is a place that you could see about this, because it showed how the people in covenant with God continued to experience great levels of adversity and loss because they did what was right in their own eyes instead of connecting with God and interacting with God and doing what God would speak to them. They would just resist that. So in our day and time, when we see a curse operating in the earth like this, it's a reminder to us that as people who have this covenant connection with God, our role, our obligation, one that has been was determined by God for us, that we must accept, is that to submit ourselves and listen to God. That's why the whole idea of worship isn't the idea of singing songs to God. It's the idea of bending my knee to God and recognizing that he is the one who sets all the terms. I simply have the blessing and the privilege of being able to walk in those terms. So when it uses words like mercy and compassion, this is God taking this step toward us, so that to open a way towards us and offer us a way we never would have found on our own, ever would have created on our own, or ever would have deserved on our own. This is completely undeserved. This is completely unearned. But it's also completely available to us. So you see why it's such a perplexing thing, in a sense for us, when we have this opportunity, but we choose to listen to someone or something else other than God. It just doesn't make any sense, unless we recognize that the only thing that would convince us to do otherwise than listen to God is just the fact that we've believed something false. And the Lord has called us to believe in him. So you'll see these elements come about in this particular term, in this particular psalm. But the term I want you to go back to is this one, loving kindness. Because loving kindness is the covenant love. God has personally obligated himself to fulfill all of his covenant to those who move in the covenant with him. That's what loving kindness means. It means no matter how strange a person or goofy a person or bad a person can be, if they will move with God in those points where God speaks to them, God will move with them, and he'll always pour out the fullness of that blessing. Many of you have heard me say at times how I marvel at who are the Bible considers as heroes, because even the biggest names in the Bible were people who did things that few of us would ever want to be identified with. Abraham tried to fulfill his own promises by taking multiple wives. Now, who wants to do that? Then you have not only Abraham. If you hear something in the background, it's my 3-year-old granddaughter. So Piper. In a minute, if she comes in, I'll show her to you. But then you have Moses, who, in trying to step into God's covenant in a way he thought was good, he murdered 2 people. And then he had to flee for his life for 40 years. You have David, who raped a woman and then plotted the death of her husband, premeditated the death of her husband. Then later in his life made a decision that caused the death of 25,000 men, or 25,000 families were affected by his poor decision. And things like this. This is a guy David, God calls a man after God's heart. You can go right down the list and you'll find very few people who lived fully exemplary lives, or moral lives even. But here's what distinguished each one of them. Even Samson. Samson's the one that always throws me, because Samson was just totally weird, did totally strange things. There's not anything in him that I would look at and say, that's the person I want to be like. And yet God holds him up in the highest regard, because at the moment God said, here's what I want you to do, pull down the building on the Philistines, Samson did it. See, God's not looking for people who are the morally upstanding ones who are in power and controlling everything. He's looking for people who will move in covenant with him at the moment he comes to us and says, now, do this. This is what I have you do today. This is where I want you to go. This is what I want you to say. If we're in that kind of position with our God, God says he will fulfill his covenant obligations to us. Not only that, there's a phrase that says the Lord is compassionate, he's slow to anger, and he's abundant in this kind of loyal love. You see, God will demonstrate all that towards us. But we have to be a people who move in covenant with him. It really simplifies for us, because it simplifies things for us, because it means we no longer have to pay attention to all the little things we're supposed to do and avoid all the things we're not supposed to do. That's what religion says God is about. God isn't about that at all. God's about one thing, and that's this connection with him. Now, you're going to see that in this psalm today, because this was a prayer of David. This is how David saw himself. This is how David saw his God. And David realized that if God wasn't the one doing it in his life, not only would it not be worth doing, it wouldn't produce anything of value. And so David would turn his heart towards God to respond to God, even in his darkest moment. When God sent the prophet Nathan to point out to David that David was the one who had done wrong, David was willing to say, I'm the man, I did it. So you see, he was willing to respond to God even in moments where he could have gone another direction. This is where God wants to bring us in this time. He wants to bring us and help us to see ourselves as a people in covenant with him. As a people whom, again, Jesus didn't come to do what he did just so that we could have a ritual of taking bread and drinking some wine out of a cup. He came to do these things so we could enter into the very covenant for which he gave everything. And that covenant is the same covenant that Jesus walked out with the Father. Because he says, I do what the Father says to me. I look to the Father and I do what I see him doing. This is the kind of covenant connection God has given us with him. So I bless you as you go forth in this psalm today. As you do it today on the 15th, it will be 2 weeks that we've been in this process. We're coming to the end of this stage of the process, but in the next few days, I'll introduce you to the next stage as we go through into the time of Pentecost at the end of May. Bless you. Bye.